Welcome back to No More Lazy Thinking, the series where we're working together to build our mental might. Today's topic is a big one, and it's one that might be a little difficult to hear. I want to talk about unconscious bias, which is a human condition. It's something that every single one of us experiences, whether we realize it or not. I guess that's why it's called unconscious bias. And there are many, many forms of this. I'm only going to talk about 6 or 7. Unconscious bias is really the consequence of thinking fast or of taking shortcuts in our thinking because of our experience. It's lazy thinking. And sometimes it serves us really well. For example, to think fast, to process the information and to come to a swift decision, to make a snap judgment, well, that serves us well at those times when, for example, we have to react for our own safety. But of course, those situations are rare. More often than not, unconscious bias kicks in, we think fast, we take shortcuts, and we don't have to. And there's a price to that. When we are leaving out all of the other variables, when we're skipping over the information and we're not taking it in because of our unconscious bias, we are missing out. We're missing out on information and we're sidelining people and ideas that we really shouldn't. An unconscious bias can trip us up in ways that we never even realize were problematic. Now, of course, the first thing to do, as with anything like this, is to become conscious of it. We overcome unconscious bias by getting conscious and aware of it. The reasons for doing that is because unconscious bias affects us in a lot of ways. It affects our perception. That's how we see people and how we perceive reality. We might be misperceiving reality just because of a strong unconscious bias. An unconscious bias can also affect our attitude, how we react in a given situation or towards other people. Unconscious bias can certainly affect our behaviors. It can lead us to respond in certain ways or to be more or less receptive to certain people. It can also affect our attitude, how positively or negatively we are taking the information in. And sometimes that attitude can reflect to others as friendly or hostile. An unconscious bias, one that we're not even aware of, can also impact our attention, how much we're tuning into a certain person or a certain source of information. It can cause us to listen more keenly or to only halfway be listening to someone. Unconscious bias, for all the same reasons, can affect the way we affirm people. We can give people micro affirmations by tuning into them, by our body language, by the way we empathize with them. And if we have a bias that we're unconscious of, we might be giving them more or less of those micro affirmations in a certain situation. Now, let me just give you a rundown, just a few examples of unconscious bias. We've talked about some of these before. If you go back and look at some of the previous videos in this series, there's one video dedicated to attribution bias. That's where we tend to view ourselves and our outcomes more favorably. We give ourselves more grace and we take more credit when we're successful than we do for other people. We tend to blame the individual instead of circumstances when it's someone else, whereas if it's something we ourselves have had trouble with, we say that's the circumstances, that's not some innate characteristic about us. So we have an attribution bias. We have an unconscious bias known as confirmation bias, which we've talked a lot about. That's favoring the information that already confirms what we believe. if we already believe it and we're just looking for confirmation, we're not really open, we're not really receptive and learning from what else is out there. Another type of unconscious bias that we've covered here before is conformity bias. And I don't think I've called it out by that name before, but this is really common. You see, we tend to go along with others in our group, even if we don't really agree. And this leads to a phenomenon known as groupthink, where even when we don't agree, for the sake of preserving group harmony, or because we don't want to be the outlier, we might not call attention to the fact that there's something else that ought to be considered. We might not offer our own opinion. We don't want to take that risk of being on the outside. Some other types of unconscious bias, and some of these are very similar, but here's one that I think is really important to note, and that is that as humans, we naturally have an affinity bias. An affinity bias is when you're biased toward someone who's more like you. Now, please don't misunderstand. I am not accusing you of discriminating against other people. I'm only wanting to shed light on the fact that you naturally have an affinity bias, and if you don't have awareness of that, if you don't acknowledge that natural unconscious bias, then you might be at risk of discriminating against others. We all need to be aware of and work to get outside of our own affinity bias. Let's see, a couple more that we want to cover here. There's something called an ambiguity bias, and you've probably experienced this. Ambiguity bias means that, of course, we're going to lean toward what we are more familiar with, what we are more certain of, where we have more information. When we're unsure about an outcome, we tend to shy away from delving into those situations. That's what drives us towards this ambiguity bias. And it's also what drives us back to an affinity bias, because we tend to believe that what we understand poses less risk to us. Maybe you've heard of a negativity bias. One more of those unconscious biases that we all deal with at some point. A negativity bias happens because we all are wired for self-preservation. So we tend to have a stronger recollection of negative memories, things that have hurt or harmed or scared us, than of positive ones. So that magnifies our discomfort when it comes to being in a situation where people are unlike us, or where their opinions that are unlike our own somehow threaten us. Let's take one more. One other type of unconscious bias is a comparison bias. Don't ever get roped into this one. It's so limiting. But a comparison bias is where we compare one thing to another. We get into some black and white thinking. If we, let's say you're comparing two people. You're going to be hiring for a job, and you compare candidate A and candidate B. Well, see, that's a false comparison. Instead of comparing two people to each other, you should be comparing each of them to an objective standard, the criteria that you set up that would make someone successful in that job. A comparison bias causes us to miss out on aiming for an ideal in virtually any situation. That's why we don't want to fall into that trap. Okay, remember, awareness is the first step. We all have these unconscious biases. Being aware of them is what enables us to overcome them and to become stronger critical thinkers.